The house was dressed for Mother's Day, sunlight streaming through lace curtains, bouquets of roses brightening every corner. The table gleamed with china she had polished the night before, each plate waiting for hands she had once fed, clothed, and nurtured. Laughter fluttered in the air, but it was brittle, fragile, a performance stretched thin. She smiled as she always did, carrying her silence like a shawl draped across her shoulders. But then, between bites of cake and the clinking of cups, the words fell sharp and merciless. "You're just a burden now." The room did not fall silent. It buzzed awkwardly, as if cruelty were normal, as if the matriarch herself were no longer central but disposable. Yet her eyes did not break, nor did her hands tremble. For beneath the soft folds of her dress and the frailty of her age, she held a secret one that would change their futures forever. There was a time when Mother's Day meant something entirely different within those walls. The mornings would begin with the scent of burnt toast and spilled orange juice as little hands scrambled to prepare breakfast in bed. The tray would wobble, carrying unevenly buttered bread, wilted flowers picked from the garden, and a handmade card scrawled with crayons. She remembered how her heart swelled at the sight of those imperfect offerings, because they were perfect in intention. Each gesture was love, unpolished and pure. And it placed her at the very center of their world. Back then, her children's voices would tumble into her room before the sun had fully risen, shouting "Happy Mother's Day," as though it were the grandest holiday of the year. Their laughter spilled over her like sunlight, their arms wrapping tightly around her neck as if she were the safest place they knew. The house echoed with warmth, not from decorations or fine meals, but from the certainty of belonging. She was not merely a mother. She was the anchor, the compass, the heartbeat of the home. Every detail of the day was about her. The way they asked her to sit still while they tidied the living room. How they pressed drawings into her hands and beamed when she praised them. How they tried and failed to keep secrets about little gifts they had hidden under pillows. Even her husband's quiet smile carried pride as he watched the children shower her with affection. She felt whole in those moments, seen, not for what she provided, but for who she was. But time, relentless and subtle, has a way of changing the air. As the children grew older, the handmade cards stopped arriving. Breakfast in bed was replaced with hurried greetings, sometimes forgotten altogether. The laughter that once came so easily grew muted, replaced by conversations about schedules, careers, and obligations. Mother's Day became less a celebration of her, and more a date on the calendar that had to be acknowledged before being brushed aside. At first, she told herself it was natural. Children grow, lives shift, priorities evolve. She clung to the memory of sticky fingers pressing flowers into her palms, to the sincerity of voices that once trembled with love. Yet as the years stretched on, the warmth she had carried like armor began to feel thin. Gestures became transactional. Affection turned into duty. Instead of belonging at the center, she began to notice her place moving to the edges. Her presence treated as a background rather than the foundation. Still, she carried on with grace. She smiled at store-bought gifts, thanked them for the perfunctory calls, and pretended not to notice when her stories were met with distracted nods. But deep down, she knew the truth. The thread of love that once bound them so tightly was fraying. The same children who had once clung to her now saw her as a responsibility, not a blessing. Mother's Day of the past lingered in her memory like a photograph left too long in the sun, the colors fading, but the outline unmistakable. She had once been cherished. Now she was tolerated. And that contrast, sharper than any insult, etched itself quietly into her heart. It did not happen all at once. The change was quiet, like a draft slipping through a window, subtle enough to be ignored at first. But she noticed it, the shift in tone, the cracks that began to form in what had once been unshakable bonds. It started with little things, small remarks that others might have brushed aside but which clung to her like burrs. a child rolling their eyes when she repeated a story. Quick, dismissive laugh at her expense, followed by the reassurance of, "Oh, it's just a joke, Mom." The sting lingered long after the chuckles faded. Mother's Day, once her favorite occasion, became increasingly hollow. Her children would arrive late, distracted, often with phones still in hand, half listening while she spoke. Cards were no longer handwritten, but purchased hastily on the way over. Signatures scrawled as an afterthought. Breakfasts were replaced with reservations at crowded restaurants. Meals less about honoring her and more about appearances. She smiled politely through it all, but inside, she felt the weight of absence, not of people, but of sincerity. Her sacrifices, the decades of long nights, the meals prepared when money was scarce, the quiet endurance of putting her children's dreams before her own were now rarely acknowledged. Instead, conversations around the table revolved around their successes, their plans, their grievances. If she tried to interject with a memory or gentle wisdom, the moment was brushed aside. "Yes, Mom, we know," they would say, eager to return to themselves. She learned to fall silent, her dignity, her only shield. It wasn't outright cruelty. Not at first, but indifference wrapped in arrogance. A son would joke about her old-fashioned ways. A daughter would sigh impatiently when she asked a question about modern gadgets. They believed themselves sophisticated, accomplished, beyond the simple gratitude they once lavished upon her. The rituals she had preserved for years, the flowers on the table, the careful cooking of her favorite dishes were dismissed as unnecessary, outdated. What had once been tradition now felt like obligation. She carried the contrast in her heart, remembering how they once clung to her every word, how they once competed to make her smile. Now they barely noticed when her smile faltered. Their arrogance blinded them to the truth. Every step they had taken toward independence was built on the foundation of her sacrifices, but she never reminded them. She let them believe their own narratives, choosing silence over bitterness. Her dignity remained intact even as their regard for her dwindled. She refused to beg for attention or gratitude, knowing her worth was not defined by their neglect. Instead, she watched, waited, and remembered. The tone of her children's voices had changed, but the core of who she was, strong, patient, unyielding, had not. The cracks widened with each passing year, but she bore them quietly, carrying herself with the same grace that had once made her the center of their world. They thought her silence was weakness. In truth, it was the stillness of someone who had already begun to see beyond their arrogance. Her story stretched far beyond the walls of that dining room, deeper than her children ever truly knew. A lifetime of sacrifice was woven into her very being, each thread marked by devotion, endurance, and a quiet strength that no one seemed to see anymore. They thought of her as ordinary, but they had forgotten how extraordinary her journey had been. There were years when sleep was a luxury she could not afford. Nights spent rocking fevers away, whispering lullabies in the dim glow of a bedside lamp. Mornings came too soon, and she would rise with swollen eyes, still finding the energy to prepare breakfast, pack lunches, and send her children out into the world with clean clothes and a smile. Her body bore the cost of those endless days, but she never complained. For her, their comfort was worth every ache, every stolen hour of rest, when money was scarce. She tightened her own belt before letting them go without. She wore old coats through brutal winters, sewing patches where fabric had frayed, while her children stepped out in new shoes they believed had come easily. Birthdays arrived with cakes she baked late into the night, disguising the fact that ingredients had been stretched thin. She carried the quiet genius of making scarcity look like abundance, ensuring they never knew the weight of what she had gone without. Her sacrifices were not only material, but personal. Dreams she once held of travel, of higher education, of pursuing passions beyond the home, were quietly folded away, traded for the more pressing dream of building her children's lives. She became their anchor, steadying them through storms, pushing them toward futures she herself would never taste. And when triumphs came, graduations, careers, marriages, they celebrated as if they had walked the road alone, forgetting the unseen figure who had cleared the path ahead. The symbolism of her endurance was everywhere. Her hands, rough and calloused, bore the story of work unending, scrubbing, sewing, kneading, lifting. Her eyes, lined with age, carried both fatigue and wisdom, the dual marks of one who had seen too much and still kept going. Even the home itself was her monument. Walls painted and repainted, gardens tended, roofs mended, all held together by her unseen labor. The family walked within the sanctuary she had built, never realizing it was her sweat and sacrifice that held it upright. Yet as years passed, the irony sharpened. The more she gave, the less they seemed to notice. Comfort bred complacency, and her children grew entitled, believing the stability they enjoyed had always been inevitable. They mistook her sacrifices as ordinary duty, dismissing the strength it took to endure what she had endured. In their arrogance, they began to see her not as the foundation of their lives, but as an old woman fading into irrelevance. Why was she underestimated now? The answer lay in the very success she had crafted for them. Her children had grown accustomed to ease, shielded from hardship by her silent labor. They saw themselves as self-made, blind to the scaffolding of sacrifice that had lifted them. And so, when she aged, when her steps slowed and her stories repeated, they forgot the woman who had carried them through decades of struggle. But she had not forgotten. Every scar, every sleepless night, every denied dream remained etched within. She knew her worth even if they did not. Her silence was not weakness. It was calculation. They thought her powerless because they no longer saw the fire beneath her calm exterior. Yet it was still there, burning steadily, waiting for the moment when truth would reveal itself. They believed they had outgrown her. What they did not know was that she had never stopped preparing for them and for herself. The underestimated mother still held the strength of every sacrifice. And that strength was about to speak louder than they ever imagined. The irony was almost cruel. Mother's Day, a day draped in flowers and greetings, was supposed to be about reverence, gratitude, and love. Yet for her, it became the stage of betrayal. The table gleamed with polished silverware. The scent of roses mingled with roasted lamb, and laughter floated like music. But beneath the warmth, sharp edges waited to pierce. It began with a careless remark, disguised as humor. "You don't need to fuss so much anymore, Mom." One child chuckled. "You're too old to keep up anyway." The others laughed, nodding. In agreement, the sound carrying a strange cruelty. She sipped her tea in silence, letting the words wash over her like cold water. She had heard similar whispers before, but never so boldly, never on this day. Then came the harsher sting. A daughter, once the recipient of endless devotion, leaned forward with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Honestly, you've become more of a burden than a help. We've got our own families, our own lives. You should step aside now." The words landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of shock and shame across the room. Some relatives shifted uncomfortably, others nodded quietly, as though agreement excused their complicity. A cousin muttered, "It's true, though. She's had her time." Another snickered, the sound echoing louder than the clinking glasses in. That moment, the celebration soured. Instead of honoring her sacrifices, they dismantled her dignity in front of the very table she had built with decades of labor and love. Each word carried the weight of betrayal, not just because of what was said, but because of who was saying it. The children she had raised, the family she had carried, now sat in judgment as if she were an obligation to be discarded. But she did not break. She did not plead, argue, or defend herself. Instead, she smiled, a faint, mysterious smile that unnerved the room. was not the smile of someone defeated, but of someone holding a truth others had yet to discover. That smile seemed out of place, almost defiant, and it unsettled those who moments before had mocked her. Her silence was more powerful than their noise. While they flung accusations, her stillness became a mirror, reflecting their greed, their arrogance, their lack of gratitude. The faint curve of her lips hinted that she knew something they didn't, that their words, cruel as they were, had no power over her. The betrayal was real, the humiliation sharp, but she did not crumble. Instead, she let them expose themselves, revealing their hearts for what they had become: callous, entitled, and blind. Her faint smile carried a promise. This was not the end of the story. The burden, they would soon realize, was not hers to carry. It was theirs, heavy and unshakable, born from their own choices. On the day meant to honor her, they thought they had stripped her of worth. Instead, they had revealed their own. And in that revelation, she found her strength. News travels quickly, especially when it carries the flavor of scandal. By the very next morning, whispers about what had transpired at the Mother's Day table seeped beyond the walls of her home. Neighbors who had once admired her as the pillar of her family now traded knowing glances, their voices lowered but sharp. Did you hear? They called her a burden. On Mother's Day of all days, one murmured at the marketplace. Another sighed. How tragic to give your life to your children only to be dismissed when you're old. The community's reactions varied, but they all cut deep. Some pitied her, painting her as a forgotten relic, someone whose best days had passed, whose sacrifices were now irrelevant. Others mocked in hushed tones, as though her plight was a cautionary tale. It happens, a woman remarked coldly. Once the children grow, the mother becomes excess. Each word reached her ears like fragments of glass, sharp, cold. An uninvited dot inside the family, arrogance grew unchecked. The children, emboldened by their cruel declaration, began treating her as though she were already displaced. Conversations shifted without her input. Decisions about the home and gatherings were made without her voice. They assumed her silence meant surrender, that her faint smile was nothing but resignation. In their eyes, she had become powerless, a shadow lingering at the edges of her own household. But within her heart, there was no defeat, only a deepening resolve. She walked the narrow lanes of her neighborhood with her head still held high, though her steps were measured and quiet. Every passing glance reminded her of her isolation, yet the sting of it only strengthened her determination. She understood something her children and neighbors did not. Silence is not weakness, and stillness is not surrender. At night, when the world slept and her house grew quiet, she sat by the window, the moonlight soft on her face. The echo of their words, burden, forgotten, step aside, returned again and again, but she refused to let them define her. She thought of the years she had poured into building their lives, the sacrifices hidden in her hands, the strength buried in her heart. That strength was still there, waiting. The loneliness pressed in, heavy and suffocating at times, but it did not break her. If anything, it carved clarity. She saw her children as they truly were, not the innocent faces she had once rocked to sleep, but adults warped by entitlement. Their arrogance was a mask, one she now understood would eventually shatter. And so she chose patience. Let them whisper. Let the neighbors pity or mock. Let her children believe she was powerless. None of it mattered. For within her, a storm was gathering quietly, a plan long set in motion, a truth she carried like an uncut diamond. Her silence, misunderstood as weakness, was in fact her sharpest weapon. She was not forgotten. She was not a burden. She was preparing. And when the time came, those who dismissed her would realize that the foundation of everything they claimed had been laid by her hands. And those same hands still held the keys to their future. Behind her faint smiles and quiet footsteps lay a truth no one around her could imagine. For years, while her children laughed off her relevance and neighbors pitied her decline, she had been quietly weaving a web of foresight. Every coin she saved, every decision she made in solitude. It's part of a plan they would never suspect. Long ago, she had recognized the shadows creeping into her children's hearts. Greed, arrogance, entitlement. The first time she heard them argue about what would be left after she was gone, she knew she had to act. That very week, she visited a lawyer in secret. No one asked where she went. No one noticed her absence, hidden in plain sight. She began crafting documents that would define her legacy on her own terms. Her days carried a rhythm her family never cared to understand. Early mornings meant reviewing papers, updating signatures, checking accounts. The evenings, while they thought she was idly knitting or lost in thought, she was poring over letters, receipts, and legal drafts. Piece by piece, she built a fortress, not of stone, but of undeniable proof. Investments diversified, properties placed under her sole name, accounts opened and protected with ironclad instructions. To the world, she was old and useless. But in reality, she was sharpening her strength in silence. Even the smallest decisions were deliberate. A conversation with a banker here, a notarized document there. She cultivated allies where they mattered, professionals bound by confidentiality, individuals who respected her wisdom more than her family ever did. Suspense quietly gathered around her like invisible armor. Her children believed she had nothing, that she was clinging desperately to the scraps of their household. But she knew the truth. They fought over imagined wealth, over illusions of power, while the real foundation lay untouched in her keeping. Every insult they hurled, every mocking laugh only deepened her resolve. She would not argue. She would not defend herself with words. Instead, she let them believe their narrative that she was weak, dependent, powerless. It was almost too easy. The more they underestimated her, the more devastating the revelation would be when the veil was lifted at night as the house fell silent. She would touch the folder tucked carefully in her drawer. Legal papers, bank slips, sealed envelopes. Her fingers traced the edges like a promise to herself. She knew the day would come when all of it would need to be revealed. And when it did, the silence of years would erupt like thunder. She was not just preparing to defend herself. She was preparing to redefine her worth in their eyes forever. They thought she was a burden. But soon, they would learn that she had been carrying the weight of their future all along, and that she alone had the power to release, eat, or lock it away. The dining room still carried the echoes of that bitter Mother's Day plates, remained stacked. The flowers already wilting in their vases, but the air was heavier than the scent of fading roses. Days had passed, and yet the insult, "You're just a burden," lingered like smoke that refused to clear. Her children walked taller in arrogance, certain they had stripped her of dignity. They didn't know that each step they took in greed brought them closer to a fall they could not escape. When she called them together again, they expected an apology, perhaps even submission. Instead, she laid a simple folder on the table. Its leather binding looked ordinary, but the silence it commanded was immediate. Fingers stopped drumming, whispers died, and all eyes fell upon her hands as she opened it. Her voice was calm, almost soft, but it carried with it an unshakable weight. She began with the will. Years ago, she had rewritten it, not once, but several times, to ensure clarity and finality. Page by page, she revealed what they never imagined. Those who had mocked her, those who had treated her with disdain, had been cut off. Their imagined inheritance, the wealth they counted as already theirs, had dissolved like mist. Gasps spread around the table, followed by a stunned silence. She let the moment linger, then continued. Properties they assumed belonged to the family had long been transferred into her sole name and then redirected through legal trusts. Accounts they thought empty brimmed with savings, investments, and returns carefully hidden from greedy eyes. She had documented everything with precision, leaving no room for dispute, her children's faces flushed with disbelief. The ones who had called her useless now found themselves powerless. The laughter that once humiliated her was replaced by stammering questions, protests, and pale disbelief. Their future, the security they thought was guaranteed, slipped from their grasp with every word she spoke. But there was more. For those who had shown her kindness, who remembered respect even in small gestures, the story was different. A niece who once brought her tea without being asked. A grandson who listened to her stories when others ignored her. A neighbor who defended her dignity when whispers spread. These names appeared in her documents. Rewarded not for bloodline but for loyalty and humanity. The contrast was stark. Greed stood empty-handed, while humility received abundance. It was a reckoning as sharp as any blade, and she wielded it with quiet precision. Her smile, faint but unyielding, returned as she closed the folder. "You thought I had nothing left," she said, not as a plea, but as a verdict. "But I was never the burden. I was the foundation." Some lowered their eyes in shame, the reality too heavy to bear. Others burst into protest, their voices trembling with entitlement and rage. But the papers, stamped and sealed, spoke louder than any argument. For the first time, she did not need to defend herself. The truth had been written, notarized, and sealed long before this day. She had not only signed her name onto documents, she had signed away their future. And as the weight of their loss settled over them, she sat taller than ever, not as a forgotten mother, but as the author of her own legacy. The storm had passed, yet its echoes remained. The house, once filled with entitled chatter, now carried a silence that felt almost sacred. Papers had been signed, futures redrawn, illusions shattered. But as she sat alone with her tea, her heart was not heavy. Instead, it carried the calm weight of clarity, the kind that comes after decades of endurance. She reflected on the insult that had pierced so cruelly. "You're just a burden." The words might have broken another soul, but she knew better. Her worth had never rested in the shallow judgments of others. True value, she realized long ago, is not granted by voices at the table, but carved through foresight, sacrifice, and resilience. She had lived those truths, even when unrecognized. And now they stood taller than the arrogance that once tried to erase her. Some of her family slowly returned to her side. Their shame was evident in their downcast eyes, in the hesitations before. Their words. They saw now what they had overlooked, the nights she had gone without so they could have more. The years she had given without complaint, the strength she carried even in silence. To them she offered no scorn, only measured forgiveness. For respect born anew, she left open the door of reconciliation, but others could not bend. The arrogant clung to their bitterness, refusing to accept what they had lost. To them, her actions were cruelty, her foresight a betrayal. Yet she knew it was not betrayal that cut them off. It was their own pride, their greed, their careless dismissal of her humanity. Their isolation was of their own making, the natural end of a path paved with entitlement. Her dignity, however, was untouched. In fact, it shone brighter than ever. She had proven that endurance is not weakness, but power waiting for its time. She had shown that a mother's silence does not mean absence, that her patience is not emptiness. Every sacrifice she once made had blossomed into a strength no insult could diminish. Looking back, she felt no desire for revenge. What she had done was not an act of spite, but of justice, a final lesson for those who had forgotten the meaning of gratitude. She hoped they would learn, though she knew not all would. But for her, the reckoning had brought peace. Her thoughts drifted to the younger ones, those who had not yet been poisoned by arrogance. To them, her legacy would not be wealth alone, but wisdom. That dignity and foresight are treasures greater than gold. She imagined them remembering her not as a frail woman mocked at a table, but as the mother who turned quiet strength into unshakable triumph. As the evening sun bathed the room in amber light, she smiled to herself. Life had tested her with hardship, loneliness, and betrayal. Yet she had endured, and more than endured, she had prevailed. Others had tried to measure her worth with shallow scales, but she had redefined it on her own terms. Her dignity had been her true fortune all along, and in that dignity she had one. The word still lingered in the air, a burden. That was the insult they hurled at her on the very day meant to honor her. Yet, as she reflected, the irony could not have been sharper. For years she had carried them through sleepless nights, through years of sacrifice, through uncounted acts of love they barely remembered. The ones who now dismissed her as weight had once rested their entire futures on her strength. But what they never understood was that she had prepared for this moment. With a steady hand and a steady heart, she signed away not only the wealth they assumed would one day be theirs, but also the illusions of power they had wrapped themselves in. The burden, it turned out, had never been her. The burden was their arrogance, their greed, their blindness to the quiet resilience that had always stood before them. As they grappled with the loss, some in silence, others in bitter protest, she felt no bitterness of her own. Instead, there was an unshakable calm, the peace of a woman who had chosen dignity over despair. She had not been defeated by their cruelty. She had redefined the terms of her worth. The message was clear, one that rang louder than their insult ever could. Arrogance fades, entitlement collapses. But foresight endures, and dignity outlasts every cruelty. Her faint smile at that Mother's Day table had not been surrender. It had been knowledge. She knew she had already secured her legacy, already risen above their scorn. In choosing wisdom over anger, preparation over dependence, she had ensured that her story would not be one of pity, but of triumph. In the end, they called her a burden. Yet it was she who carried their futures, and she who carried them away. And with that, she left behind not defeat, but a legacy that would live far beyond their arrogance,